joining us now from our Perth studios. Principal at the PR Council, of course, Kristy McSweeney, our regular Tuesday night guest. Welcome, Kristy. Great to see you as usual. Let's get stuck in. I'm going to kick off with the front page of The Australian. Of course, the Telly, the SMH and the Fin have got the blueprint, the COVID relief blueprint that the Prime Minister is keen to show the Australian public, and that will be on the front pages of tomorrow's papers. The PM's blueprint for COVID relief. Scott Morrison has unveiled a new model of economic support for COVID-19 outbreaks, with taxpayers to spend about $1.5 billion a fortnight on direct payments to help businesses and workers endure the extended lockdown of Greater Sydney. The new model, which provides far greater levels of state government support, will apply to future lockdowns that premiers are free to impose as a last resort under the first two phases of National Cabinet's four-step plan aimed at returning life to normal. Now, Kristy, while you're speaking about this particular initiative, we will go to the Telly as well. Outbreak bucks is the headline there, and of course the SMH. We'll get to them shortly. Kristy, your thoughts on this particular COVID blueprint that the Prime Minister has unveiled?
Well, of course, last week or the week before, we had the COVID four-phase map out for Australia, which was heavily dependent on getting enough of the population vaccinated, and it did say lockdowns were a last resort. That was agreed to at National Cabinet, and I think we all thought, oh, it's over to the extent that they might be shorter and less economically damaging, but it looks like this one in New South Wales is gearing up to be as long or possibly a little bit shorter, but certainly a significant length of time, similar to the one we had in Melbourne last year, which went for about 3.5 to 4 months. Number of significant funds announced, $5 billion between the federal government and the New South Wales government. Of course, south of the border, Gleeson, in Melbourne, the package has not really been very well received. The federal government is trying to make the distinction between the 2-week circuit breaker lockdown that we've recently had in Melbourne, as opposed to the 3 to 4 month lockdown we had in 2020, which was pretty thin on the ground in terms of support outside of JobKeeper. So this is all about the end of JobKeeper and how the Victorian government is seeking very, very hard to wedge Treasurer Josh Frydenberg.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the Sydney Morning Herald splash really gives us an insight into how long this particular lockdown will take, and state braces for long lockdown. That's the headline. And the New South Wales government has laid the foundations for Sydney to be in lockdown for another 4 weeks, setting aside $4 billion to support businesses across the state, as well as all workers who have had their hours cut. With Premier Gladys Berejiklian poised today to extend Sydney's lockdown, the New South Wales government has announced its biggest economic support package in history as it tries to lessen the pain of the shutdown. Now, of course, Kristy, I regard you as a lockdown veteran, a specialist in many respects, having been through what happened in Melbourne, and of course then as soon as you headed over to Perth, they locked you down as well. It is and I'm being flippant and I shouldn't be, but it is a terribly, terribly difficult time for businesses. And it's also, from a mental health perspective, incredibly challenging, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think the government did release today as well more funding into mental health, which has been welcomed by people in New South Wales. It's certainly also been welcomed by people in Victoria who do know how hard it was going through that long, extended lockdown last year, and as you say, Gleeson, I was one of them. It is really difficult to see economic impact in Australia come to this. It's really difficult to see businesses close down, to see people out of work. The federal government is trying to mitigate this the best that they possibly can, but there will be continued calls from the states to bring back JobKeeper. What they've announced today is a type of JobKeeper, but I think we're going to have calls from the premiers to have an agreement locked in that there will be income support provided by the Commonwealth along that JobKeeper system as these keep occurring. And that's going to be really hard to keep forecasting into the budgets.
Well, let's just stick with this theme and go to the Fin Review. virus firms, workers get $5 billion lifeline. That's the splash head. But Jennifer Hewitt, who writes incredibly well on the front of the fin, has said it's unclear if this support will be sufficient to repeat last year's success of JobKeeper in maintaining the economy, jobs and confidence over many months. And that is the $64 million question, isn't it, Kristy? I mean, you know, you can throw a lot of money at businesses, but at the end of the day, you know, if they just keep getting pounded, and we've seen this on the Gold Coast, you know, in my backyard here, we've seen this. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at them. When they keep getting pounded and pounded and pounded and the confidence depletes, a lot of them just pack up and go home.
The federal government was rightly celebrated for implementing JobKeeper very quickly. There was some few snags around how come it wasn't a tiered response tied to business revenue, but the easiest way they could get it out was through the single touch payroll, and it was a blanket payment to businesses. I feel that the federal government being celebrated for implementing that policy has become less and less remembered as the states are seeking more and more and more support and more assurances from the federal government to continue to forecast that expenditure. And don't forget, once we get to MyEFO in December, the mid-year economic fiscal outlook, the mini update, before we go to an election next year, so we're told, the government wants those numbers to be extremely tight. It cannot afford to continue shelling out expensive income supplements to the states. There has to be a consistent national cabinet agreement, which is what the Prime Minister has come to today. And I think the premiers are just going to have to accept that we have moved on from JobKeeper, and this is the fiscal response going forward up to MyEFO in December.